not a part of these themes that we're on at the moment. Calling Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I'm very happy to take a call on the communities of online learning, perhaps a far more controversial part of the bill than the earlier provisions that we were debating, although there was some controversy in those as well. And so I want to canvass some of the concerns that have been raised around communities of online learning and put some of the questions to the Minister about how the government proposes to address them. The first point that I would note is that there are still a lot of questions to be answered about how communities of online learning, or basically online schools, would operate, and the regulatory framework as set by legislation for these schools is so much sketchier compared to every other school in the country. So many of the other provisions that we're debating here over an Education Act that spans hundreds of pages relate to changing provisions around existing schooling. There is hundreds and hundreds of pages of primary law that relates to how schools should operate. And now we're establishing a new category of school in this bill that has only a couple of pages relating to it. The primary legislation relating to communities of online learning is very, very sketchy when compared to the legislation that governs the operation of other schools. And so my first question to the government is, why wasn't all of the work done on how these would operate before the legislation was brought to the House? Because it seems to me that the House, the Parliament, is being asked by the government to just trust us, that we will do this by regulation, when actually the House has not just trusted government to determine how other schools will operate. We've got primary legislation that governs that. But in terms of some of the specific concerns that were raised by submitters to the Select Committee, and the first really deals with people with disabilities and at-risk learners. And there was a general concern raised by submitters that online learning would be seen as a dumping ground for the most difficult students and the most at-risk students in the education system, those who are behaviourally difficult to manage within schools, or whose additional learning needs makes them more challenging for a school to provide education for. And so the first question to the Minister on this particular topic is how the government are going to ensure that doesn't happen, that online learning provision isn't seen as the de facto alternative for kids who don't necessarily easily fit the the standard mould of the school system. And I think that that's a particularly important one. The Ombudsman raised concerns about that, along with many of the disability groups during the Select Committee process. And many submitters also noted that through the United Nations and the conventions that we've signed up to, we have signed up to an inclusive education system, and online learning providers will need to adhere to the principles of those international conventions. And so how will the government ensure that all of our commitments around equal opportunities in education, around support for people with disabilities, how will they be met by the online learning providers? Because certainly the primary law around that is less specific. The next set of questions really is around the values of kids attending a school and the social interactions that come with that. So if a child's sitting at home or wherever they might be, engaging on a laptop, how will they be exposed to the types of social interactions that are actually an integral part of the educational process? So education is about learning to read and write and do maths and all of those other things. But if we go back to the debate we had in the last theme that we were addressing, where we talked about why we have a public education system and the things that we want kids to develop, we want them resilience, good interpersonal skills, all of those things that we've now inserted into the legislation as being desirable, how will we ensure that the kids who are not in a school but who are engaging through an online provider, how will the government ensure that they're still getting that level of exposure to other people and to other kids, which is also an integral part of their educational journey? Because actually some of the kids who might be drawn naturally to online learning provision are often some of the kids who benefit most from being in an environment that sometimes takes them a little bit outside their comfort zone and forces them to interact with other kids. And so I'd hate to see them being shut out from the educational experiences there. The second, or the third question I think I have for the Minister is around kids in isolated and rural communities, and Mr Chair, and how the government will ensure that again, this isn't seen as the de facto option for those children. We've got a number of very, very small schools in New Zealand, and I can see the member opposite nodding. He's got a number of them in his electorate. Yeah, and but they're very small schools, and some of them have only got half a dozen kids at them, and they're the most expensive for the government to operate. I know that this has been something that successive ministers of education have looked at, and the conclusion that they've reached is actually we continue to provide those very small schools and fund them because that is the way we ensure quality educational opportunities for those kids. And so one of the anxieties that was raised during the process was that online learning could be seen as an alternative to the ongoing provision of very small educational providers, small schools in rural and isolated areas. And so I'd like some reassurance from the government, or the current government, that they won't be seeing this as an alternative. And in fact, how will they ensure that that doesn't become the alternative in those areas? We were presented with some very good evidence at the Select Committee of the online learning experiences from overseas, in the United States in particular, where online charter schools have been in existence for significantly longer than anything equivalent on this side of the world. And it highlighted some successes. There were some successes, but the failures were greater than the successes. And that's not to say that we shouldn't pick up and learn from the success stories, because there certainly were some, but we should also learn from the failures. And I was particularly interested in the research by Michael Barber from Toronto University, who gave a very detailed summary of the international studies that have been done on online learning provision, particularly in the United States. And it found that when online learning is done badly, it's done very badly, and the effect on those children is huge. And they found that, I haven't got the numbers right in front of me, but in terms of their literacy progression, the kids who were doing bad online learning provision were behind by about 73, I think, days, or 78 days out of 180 days in their learning. And in maths, they were 180 days behind out of 180 days of their learning. In other words, their numeracy didn't progress at all through online learning provision, and their literacy, relative to the expectations, was significantly below. Now, that was from the bad providers. But one of our jobs as parliamentarians is to ensure that we don't end up with bad providers as a result of this legislative change. So I'm interested in knowing how the government will ensure that that doesn't happen, because I think that that's important. Then we come to the regulatory impact statement in terms of what's driving this. And the regulatory impact statement states, quote, "The Act discourages other providers from entering the market," end quote. And they use that as the justification for changing this. And yet, if we go back to why the original Education Act in New Zealand was passed in 1877, the principle behind passing it was that the public have a right, a fundamental legal right to a public education. It's not a marketplace, it's a right. And so why the competition? What's the driver behind wanting more competition in this space? If it's simply to modernise the correspondence school, that's something that I can sign up to, no problem. I think the correspondence school legislation is absolutely in need of updating. The correspondence school legislation was passed in the days when they used to post out workbooks and they would be posted back. Now, of course, most of the correspondence school provision is online, and of course the law needs to be updated to reflect that. I did correspondence. I did correspondence through my local school because that correspondence provision was an alternative. So you could have a wider range of subjects. The school didn't have the resources to offer all the subjects, so I did history and French. French wasn't very good. Don't ask me to speak anything. But I did do history successfully through correspondence because my school was unable to offer it. Now kids are doing that online at their local school. That's great. So if this is about extending the range of options available to schools in terms of online learning provision, so the kids still get that social interaction with their peers and the pastoral care that comes with going to school, that's something that I can sign up to as well, because I think that that would be great. And I think that schools are already doing some really good things in that space with sharing teachers through online provision and so on. So I want to know what's the driver behind the legislative change, because there's already stuff that's happening. It's not just about modernising the correspondence school. This bill goes far wider than that, and there are real pitfalls in it.
Mr Chair.
The Honourable Hikia Parata.
Mr Chair.